Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to tackle some econ. Today it's straight from the CFA Level 1 curriculum. Kind of like a crash course, really, on how markets and businesses work. But don't worry, no textbooks required. We're going to be working with excerpts from the CFA materials themselves. We've got some practice questions to really get those brain cells firing. And even, believe it or not, even some errata. Because, hey, sometimes even the experts get things wrong.
It's true. It's true. It's actually, it can be pretty interesting to look at the errata, see how things change. It's a continuous process, this learning in finance.
For sure, for sure. So I don't know about you, but have you ever been like completely baffled by why gas prices seem to bounce all over the place, or how companies figure out, what they can actually charge for the stuff they're selling? Well, today we're going to dive deep into those questions, and we're going to start with demand. And this really fascinating concept of elasticity.
Yeah, elasticity is really one of those foundational principles, and it helps us understand how sensitive buyers are to price changes. So I guess, like, if the price of, let's say, a cup of coffee goes up by, I don't know, just a few cents, and suddenly everyone's like, forget it, I'm drinking tea now, I guess we'd say the demand for that coffee is pretty elastic, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
The quantity demanded changed a lot because of a small price increase. But now let's imagine something like gasoline, right?
Yeah.
Even if the price goes way up, people still got to get to work, so the demand probably won't change as much.
Right. People need gas. So we call that inelastic demand.
Exactly.
So how do we actually measure this elasticity thing? I mean, it can't just be like, a lot or a little.
Right. That's a great point. It's a precise calculation. The percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. So this number, we call it the elasticity coefficient. It gives us a concrete way to understand how consumers are going to react to price changes.
So the textbook uses a great example with gasoline prices. But one thing that I was wondering about is it seems like the elasticity actually changes depending on where you are on the demand curve. Am I right about that?
You are absolutely right. You're picking up on something really important here. So a linear demand curve, that doesn't necessarily mean consistent elasticity. Think about it this way. At really, really low prices, even a huge price change, that might not scare away too many buyers.
Because they're thinking, gas is basically free, let's fill the tank.
Yeah, exactly. But at those higher prices, even a little price increase, that could make people rethink how much they're driving. That's when you see elastic demand. And then, of course, you've got the middle ground, right? That sweet spot where the percentage change in quantity demanded, it matches the percentage change in price perfectly. We call that unit elastic demand.
Gotcha. Okay, so now for a curveball. Are there ever situations where, like, if the price goes up, people actually buy more?
There are. These are the exceptions. These are the fascinating exceptions to the law of demand. So we've got things like Giffen goods and Veblen goods.
Oh yeah, those are pretty interesting.
Giffen goods, they're super rare. But imagine like a really basic food, a staple, like in a community struggling with poverty. Now, if the price of that food goes up, people might actually buy more of it because they just can't afford other food anymore.
Wow, so they're basically forced to prioritize the absolute necessities even if the price goes up. That's kind of wild. What about Veblen goods? How do they fit in?
So Veblen goods, those are a totally different story. They're luxury items where a higher price actually makes them more desirable because it shows how prestigious and exclusive they are. Think, high-end fashion brands or super rare collectibles.
Okay, so it's like the more expensive it is, the more I want it type of thing. Interesting. I used to think businesses just like added up all their expenses and then just like slapped on a profit margin to set prices. But it seems like it's got to be way more complicated than that, right?
You're right. It's way more nuanced. There's this really important difference between accounting costs and economic costs. And understanding that can be a game changer for businesses.
So, okay, break it down for me. What's the difference between accounting costs and economic costs?
All right, so accounting costs, those are the straightforward expenses you see on a company's financial statements, right? Raw materials, wages, rent, all those tangible costs. But economic costs, they take a broader view. They include something called opportunity cost, which is basically the potential benefit a company misses out on by picking one option over another.
Ah, so it's about understanding the unseen costs of the road not traveled.
You got it. And that's where it gets really interesting for businesses, especially when they're making those short-term decisions about how to operate.
So, okay, can you give me a real world example of this, like how opportunity cost actually plays out for a business?
Sure, let's say a company's trying to decide whether to buy a new fancy piece of equipment.
Yeah.
Now, the accounting cost, that's just the price tag. Pretty straightforward, right?
Hmm.
But the economic cost, that also factors in the potential profits they could have made by investing that money somewhere else, maybe in marketing or research or, developing new products.
So it's a much more strategic way of thinking about costs, not just like what's the sticker price.
Absolutely. It forces businesses to think long-term and big picture.
Got it. And the textbook used an example of a firm that uses both labor and capital, to make their product. Could you walk me through how that works, like with opportunity cost?
Sure, yeah. So in the short term, some costs are fixed, right? Think of that factory rent we talked about earlier. But then the company has to decide how much to actually produce based on variable costs, like labor. And they've got to consider the revenue they expect to bring in, of course. But they also need to think about the profits they might be giving up if they chose to, use those resources in a totally different way.
It's all about making those smart decisions, weighing the visible costs and those invisible costs. Okay, I'm starting to get a better grasp on this. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about the different types of markets out there.
Okay, great. Think of it like a spectrum. So on one end, you've got perfect competition, and on the other, you have a pure monopoly. Let's start with perfect competition. Imagine a market with tons of sellers, all selling basically the same exact thing, like a farmer's market where, everyone's selling apples, the same kind of apples.
Got it, got it. So no single seller, they don't have any power to control the price. They're all just subject to the forces of supply and demand. And if one farmer decides to be greedy and charge more for their apples, people are just going to, go to the next stall over and buy their apples there.
Exactly. That's perfect competition in action.
So now let's move along that spectrum. What about this thing called monopolistic competition?
Okay, so with monopolistic competition, you still have a bunch of sellers, but now the products are a little bit different from each other.
Okay.
So think of restaurants, or clothing stores, where each business is trying to create its own identity, its own style to try to attract customers.
So each seller has a bit of wiggle room with their prices, but competition still keeps those prices from getting out of control.
Right. Consumers still have options. Now, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you've got monopolies, the kings and queens of pricing power. So these are markets dominated by a single seller, often because it's just super hard for competitors to enter the market. Think about utility companies or drug companies with patents on their medications.
That doesn't sound so great for consumers, not having any choice, that is.
You're right. Monopolies do raise concerns, right,
Mhm.
about higher prices and less output compared to markets that are more competitive. But the source material actually points out some potential upsides to imperfect competition, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Okay, so is there ever a good reason for competition to be like less than perfect?
There can be. Some economists, notably Schumpeter, have argued that imperfect competition, that it can actually be a driving force for innovation. Companies, they're always trying to stand out from the crowd, which can lead to new products and new technologies that ultimately benefit consumers.
So it's not just about keeping prices low, it's also about pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah. And the source material actually uses the car market as an example. The competition between German and Japanese car manufacturers, they're constantly innovating to stay ahead of each other. And in the end, that benefits us, the consumers, right? Safer cars, more efficient cars, higher quality cars.
It's like finding that balance between making sure that consumers are treated fairly, and that companies are still incentivized to innovate and do cool stuff.
Exactly.
Okay. Now let's zoom out a bit. Let's shift our focus to macroeconomics, the study of the whole economy as a big system. I know GDP, gross domestic product, that's like the big kahuna, right? One of the most important indicators we use to understand how an economy is doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
GDP measures the total value of everything produced within a country's borders, over a specific period of time. But there are actually two ways to calculate it. So you've got nominal GDP, which uses current market prices, and then you have real GDP, which adjusts for inflation.
Okay, so I've always been a little fuzzy on the difference between nominal and real GDP. Like, why is it so important to make that distinction?
Sure, yeah. So let's say nominal GDP increases by, let's say, 5% in a year. That sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah.
But what if inflation was like 3% during that same year? That means the actual increase in output, after you adjust for those rising prices, it was only 2%. That's where real GDP comes in. It gives us a more accurate picture of real economic growth.
So real GDP helps us cut through the noise and see if an economy is actually growing, not just experiencing rising prices.
Right, right. And to calculate that inflation adjustment, we use something called the GDP deflator. It's just a ratio, nominal GDP to real GDP. And it tells us, how much prices have changed overall in an economy.
Okay, so it's giving us that bigger picture view. When I think about those economic ups and downs, I always wonder, like, how are those periods actually defined? What makes an economic boom, or a recession?
Well, that's where the business cycle comes in. GDP is our key to tracking these periods, these cyclical periods of expansion and contraction. So when real GDP is growing, that means we're in an expansionary period. Typically, unemployment's low, businesses are investing, and there's this general sense of optimism.
Right, the let's go out and celebrate times.
Exactly. But eventually, that growth starts to slow down, we hit a peak, and then things start to contract, to shrink. So real GDP declines, unemployment goes up, businesses get more cautious with their investments.
It's the tighten your belt kind of period, right?
Yeah. And eventually we hit a trough, the lowest point, before things start to recover and expand again. It's this continuous cycle of ups and downs.
I'm sure our listeners, they've experienced these economic swings firsthand, right? And they probably have their own stories about how those periods have affected their lives, and the decisions they've made. Now, when we talk about trying to manage these economic waves, these ups and downs, fiscal and monetary policy, those are the big levers that always come up, right? Can you remind me how those work?
Sure. So fiscal policy, that refers to the government's use of spending and taxes to influence the economy. Think of infrastructure projects to create jobs, or tax cuts to encourage people to spend more.
So it's all about how the government manages its own finances to impact the broader economy. Okay, what about monetary policy? How does that work?
So monetary policy, that's controlled by the central bank. They use tools like interest rates and adjustments to the money supply to try to keep inflation in check and make sure the economy is growing at a healthy pace.
So it's all about managing that flow of money and credit within the financial system. It sounds like a delicate balancing act for both the government and the central bank, right?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And there are always debates, right? Debates about the best approach. The source material even mentions the IMF model and the whole controversy surrounding quantitative easing.
Yeah.
And examples of just how complex these policy decisions can be.
So it's not as simple as just, flipping a switch and fixing the economy, unfortunately. Speaking of complex systems, can we unravel this concept of the balance of payments? It sounds like some massive accounting ledger for a country's economic interactions with, the rest of the world.
It's a great way to think about it. The balance of payments, or BOP, it keeps track of all those economic transactions between the residents of a country and everyone else in the world, over a specific period, usually a year. It's this comprehensive view of how a country engages with the global economy.
Okay, so it's capturing everything from like imports and exports to investments, loans, all those financial flows across borders.
You got it. And it's broken down into two main accounts: the current account and the capital account.
So current account and capital account, gotcha.
Right. So the current account, that focuses on the flow of goods and services, as well as, income payments and transfers. It's basically a country's trade balance sheet.
Okay. So like if a country sells more stuff to the rest of the world than it buys, it has a current account surplus, right?
Precisely. And if it buys more than it sells, then it has a current account deficit.
And the capital account, that's all about the movement of, capital.
Right. It tracks investments, loans, all those financial assets. Think of it as the financial side of the equation, showing changes in a country's ownership of foreign assets and foreign ownership of domestic assets.
So are these two accounts, are they connected somehow?
They are. And that's where it gets really interesting. The current account and the capital account, they must always balance each other out. Always.
Wait, so if a country is running a current account deficit, then it has to have a capital account surplus to offset it, like a seesaw?
Precisely, like a seesaw. So a current account deficit, that means a country's relying on capital inflows, money coming in from the rest of the world.
So they're essentially borrowing from other countries to finance their spending.
Wow. It's amazing how all these pieces fit together. I've heard a lot about those large current account deficits in countries like the United States. Is that something to be worried about?
That's a great question. It's a question that economists and policymakers debate all the time.
Hmm.
A persistent current account deficit can lead to a buildup of foreign debt, which can make a country vulnerable to external shocks, events outside their control. But the balance of payments, it's complex, right? So there's no easy answer about whether a deficit is good or bad. It depends on a lot of factors. So it's all about understanding the context, right? And what's actually driving those imbalances.
Exactly. That's what makes economics so interesting
Yeah.
and so challenging. It's about seeing how all these pieces fit together, both within a country and on global scale.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our economic deep dive, from the micro level decisions of individuals and businesses to the macro forces that shape entire economies. But there's still so much more to explore. What other fascinating economic adventures await us, you think?
Well, in the next part of our journey, we're going to tackle the world of exchange rates, the impact of, all those geopolitical risks on the global economy, and the really important role of international trade.
Can't wait to delve into all of that. Stay tuned, everyone, for the next chapter of our economic exploration. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to our deep dive.
Before we got into that whole balance of payments thing, we were talking about how GDP tracks the ups and downs of the business cycle, those booms and busts. But I think the thing that's really interesting to me is this whole idea of productivity. It's like this quiet force, but it has such a huge impact on long-term economic growth, right?
You're absolutely right. Productivity, it's often overlooked, but it's like the engine.
Mm.
It drives long-term prosperity.
Yeah.
If a country wants to see living standards improve, it needs to figure out how to produce more stuff, more output with the same amount of input. Or even better, less input.
So it's not just about working harder, it's about working smarter, finding those innovations, finding ways to be more efficient, to do more with less.
Exactly. And the source material highlights this point with a really interesting example. Comparing Mexico to a bunch of European countries. Right. Yeah, I remember that. Mexico, they've had pretty rapid economic growth lately, but their productivity growth, it hasn't kept up with places like Germany or France or Spain. What's the takeaway there?
It shows that without those productivity gains, rapid economic growth, it just isn't sustainable. Businesses, they face a tough choice: either squeeze their profit margins by keeping wages low, or raise prices, which, that can lead to inflation, which can hurt consumer demand. It's a tough spot to be in.
So it's kind of a vicious cycle. Low productivity can hold back growth, and that affects everyone. And I'm guessing this has implications for investors too.
Absolutely. When you see low productivity growth, that's a warning sign, because it suggests that companies might have trouble increasing their profits. And that can lead to stagnant stock prices or even declining stock prices.
So if you're thinking about investing in a company or even a whole country, you got to have productivity growth on your radar. Okay, so what actually drives productivity? Like, what can countries or companies actually do to boost it?
Well, there are several factors, and they all kind of work together. Technology is a big one, obviously. Those game-changing innovations that let us do more with less effort. The internet, automation, AI, these are all huge for productivity.
So investing in research and development, that's got to be key, right? Both for companies and for countries that want to stay ahead.
For sure. But it's not just about the gadgets, Education, skills development, those are equally important. A workforce that's well-educated, highly skilled, they're more adaptable, more innovative, and ultimately more productive.
So it's about investing in human capital, not just the technology.
Exactly. And then we can't forget about, investment in a more traditional sense. Businesses need access to capital, right?
Yeah.
So they can invest in new equipment, expand their operations, actually implement these new technologies.
So a healthy financial system, a government that supports businesses, those are all part of the puzzle too. It's a complex web. But it seems like the main idea is to create an environment where innovation can thrive. Now let's shift the gears a bit and talk about inflation. It's been a big topic in the news lately. I know it means a general increase in prices, but what's the real impact of that? Like, how does it actually affect people?
Well, the biggest impact is on your purchasing power. When prices go up, your money just doesn't buy as much. So your standard of living can take a hit.
So it's like It's like your money's worth less than it used to be. How do we actually measure inflation, by the way?
We use several different measures. So one is the Consumer Price Index, CPI, which tracks changes in the prices of a basket of goods and services that typical households buy.
So it's a way of measuring like the cost of living, right?
Yeah.
How those everyday expenses are changing over time.
Right, right. Then there's the Producer Price Index, PPI, which looks at the prices that producers are getting for their goods and services. This can give us an idea of potential future price increases for consumers, since those rising costs are often passed along.
And then there's that GDP deflator that we talked about earlier, which is kind of broader measure of price changes across the whole economy.
Right, but it's important to remember that not every price increase is inflation. Sometimes, prices go up because of temporary things like supply chain disruptions or maybe bad weather. That's not inflation. True inflation is a persistent, broad-based increase in prices.
Okay, so what causes that kind of persistent inflation? And is it always a bad thing?
Well, there are different theories about what causes inflation. One common explanation is demand pull inflation. This happens when there's too much money chasing too few goods. It's like a popular concert where everyone wants tickets. That high demand pushes prices up.
So it's all about that balance, right, between supply and demand.
Exactly. And this ties back to what we were talking about earlier,
Right.
monetary policy. If the central bank pumps too much money into the economy, it can lead to that excess demand and fuel inflation.
Makes sense. Is there another side to this inflation coin?
There is. Another common explanation is cost push inflation. This is what happens when the costs of production go up. So businesses have to raise prices to maintain their profits. Things like rising wages, higher energy costs, or increases in the price of raw materials.
So those increased costs are ultimately passed along to us, the consumers.
Right. And when inflation is persistent, it can create a lot of uncertainty, a lot of instability in the economy. People start to worry about what their money will be worth in the future. Businesses hesitate to invest, and consumers might hold off on making big purchases. It can have a chilling effect.
Yeah, it can really put a damper on economic growth.
It can. That's why central banks, they're always trying to keep inflation under control. They aim for a sweet spot, low and stable inflation, usually around 2%.
So it's like a constant balancing act for policymakers. Now let's switch gears again and talk about unemployment. I know it's another one of those key indicators that tells us how healthy an economy is.
It is. It measures how many people are actively looking for work but can't find it. It's a really important way to see how well an economy is using its labor resources.
And I know there are different types of unemployment, right? Not all unemployment is created equal.
Exactly. So first you have frictional unemployment. This is just a natural part of a dynamic economy, right? People are always transitioning between jobs, taking time to find the right fit. It's a temporary thing.
Like a pit stop on the career journey.
Right. Then you've got structural unemployment, which is a bit more of a long-term problem. It happens when there's a mismatch between the skills that workers have and the skills that employers need, as technology changes or industries rise and fall.
So workers might need to, retrain, get new skills to adapt.
Right. And then finally, you've got cyclical unemployment. And this is directly tied to those swings in the business cycle that we talked about. When the economy shrinks, demand for goods and services falls, businesses have to cut back. And unfortunately, that often means laying off workers.
So it's that domino effect, right? The economy weakens, people lose their jobs, and then, of course, high unemployment. That can have ripple effects on everything, consumer spending, government budgets. It's all connected.
Absolutely. Now, remember those fiscal and monetary policy tools you were talking about. Those can be used to try to tackle both unemployment and inflation.
Okay, yeah. Remind me how those fit in.
So when the economy's weak, governments often use fiscal policy to try to stimulate demand and get people back to work. Things like increasing spending on infrastructure projects or maybe offering tax cuts to businesses and individuals.
It's about putting money into the economy, encouraging people to spend, get things moving again.
Exactly. And monetary policy can help too. The central bank might lower interest rates to make it cheaper to borrow money and invest, hoping to stimulate business activity and job creation.
So it really does require a coordinated effort, right? The
Yes.
government and the central bank working together to try to steer the economy in the right direction.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
But there's always debate, right, about the best way to do it. Economics, it's complex. There's rarely a simple solution.
No, no magic bullet, unfortunately. Okay, speaking of the global picture, I'm curious about exchange rates. I know they determine, how much one currency is worth compared to another. But what actually makes those rates go up and down?
Exchange rates, they're influenced by a whole mix of things. Economic factors, political factors, interest rates, for example, play a big role. If a country has higher interest rates than other countries, it tends to attract foreign investors
Right.
who want to earn those higher returns. And that increased demand for the currency that pushes its value up. We call that appreciation.
So higher interest rates can make a currency more attractive. What about inflation? I'm guessing that has an impact too.
You bet. High inflation usually has the opposite effect. If a country's inflation is higher than its trading partners, its currency will probably depreciate, lose value, because its purchasing power is declining faster.
So inflation can actually make a currency less desirable. What
Right.
are some of the other key drivers?
Well, economic growth is another big one. If a country's economy is doing well, investors see it as a good place to put their money,
Hmm.
which can drive up demand for its currency and lead to appreciation.
It's like a vote of confidence,
Yeah.
from the global investment community.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can't underestimate the role of political stability. Countries with stable political systems, sound economic policies, they tend to have stronger currencies
Hmm.
because investors feel more comfortable putting their money there.
So it's about trust, right? Trust in the government, trust in the institutions. It's amazing how much goes into this.
It is. And on top of all those fundamental factors, you also have speculation. Traders in the foreign exchange market, they buy and sell currencies based on their predictions about, where they think the price is going to go. And that can sometimes really amplify those fluctuations in exchange rates.
So it's not always, perfectly rational. It's not always just driven by the economic fundamentals. Human behavior, market psychology, those play a role too.
Oh, absolutely. They're huge factors. Now, not all exchange rate systems are the same. Some countries have floating exchange rates, where the value is determined by market forces, supply and demand. Most of the major currencies, like the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, they all operate under a floating system.
So their value's always fluctuating based on, those market dynamics we've been talking about.
Right. And then you have fixed exchange rate systems, where a country pegs its currency to another currency or to a basket of currencies. This can provide stability, but it also means that the country has less control over its own monetary policy.
So it's like a trade-off between stability and flexibility. Are there any systems that kind of fall in between?
Yeah. Some countries have what we call hybrid systems, like managed floats. So they let their currency fluctuate within a certain range, but they might intervene in the market, to smooth out volatility or try to influence its value.
Okay, so there's a whole spectrum of exchange rate systems out there. Choosing the right one, that must be a pretty tough decision for countries to make. Speaking of complex systems, can we talk about international trade? It seems like such a fundamental part of how the global economy works.
It is. It's absolutely essential. International trade allows countries to specialize in what they're good at and trade with other countries to get things they're not so good at producing. This specialization is based on the idea of comparative advantage.
So even if a country could, theoretically make everything it needs itself, it still makes sense to focus on its strengths and trade with others for everything else.
Exactly. That way, countries can produce more overall, and you get a more efficient use of resources on a global scale.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here, but I know there are always heated debates about trade, and the word protectionism comes up a lot. Can you explain what that means and why it's so controversial?
Sure. Protectionism refers to government policies that restrict trade, usually to protect domestic industries from competition from foreign companies.
Mm.
Policies like tariffs, quotas, subsidies.
So it's about shielding domestic businesses from the full force of global competition.
Right. And while there can be some short-term benefits to that, for specific industries, economists generally agree that protectionism leads to higher prices for consumers, less innovation, and a less efficient use of resources overall.
So it can actually hurt economic growth in the long run.
It can. That's why a lot of economists advocate for free trade, which basically means letting goods and services flow freely across borders without those artificial barriers.
But I imagine there's always political pressure, right, to protect certain industries, especially those that are struggling to compete with companies overseas. It's a tough issue.
It is. It's about balancing economic efficiency with political realities.
Mm.
That's one of the big challenges of trade policy. Speaking of global forces, I'm curious about the role of those giant multinational corporations. They seem to have so much power in the global economy.
They do. Multinational corporations, or MNCs, they operate in multiple countries, and they've been a big driver of foreign direct investment, FDI. That's when a company invests in building or acquiring productive assets in another country, not just importing and exporting.
So they're actually setting up shop, in multiple countries.
Exactly. And that FDI, it can be a big boost for economic growth, especially in developing countries. Brings in capital, technology, new jobs.
But I imagine there are some concerns about the influence of these massive companies, right? Yeah, there definitely are. Critics often say that MNCs can exploit workers in developing countries, that they can dodge taxes, that they can even influence governments. It's a complex issue with valid points on both sides.
So it's important to be aware of the potential benefits and the potential risks, right, of these powerful global actors.
Hmm.
Speaking of risks, what about all those geopolitical threats that seem to be, popping up more and more? How do they affect the global economy?
Yeah, great question. Geopolitical risks, those are the events or trends in international relations that could really disrupt things. So you've got political instability, terrorism, conflicts between countries,
Yeah.
even pandemics like the one we all just went through.
Yeah, those are the wild cards, right? The things that can mess up even the best economic forecasts.
Right. And the source material, it points out how those geopolitical risks can affect everything. Trade flows, investment decisions, currency values, stock market volatility, they can really shake things up.
So it's a reminder that economics doesn't happen in a bubble, right? The political world, global events, they all have an impact. And it seems like in today's world where everything's so interconnected, investors and businesses really need to pay attention to these risks.
Absolutely. What happens on one side of the world can quickly have an impact on the other side. It's a crucial thing to consider these days.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground in this second part of our economic deep dive. We talked about the things that drive long-term growth, the complexities of inflation and unemployment. We even ventured into the global arena, talking about exchange rates, international trade, and those unpredictable geopolitical risks.
We did. And the final part of our deep dive, we'll wrap things up by talking about some strategies for navigating this complex economic world. And we'll discuss some key takeaways that you can actually use to make smarter decisions, both in your personal life and with your investments.
I can't wait to get into those practical insights. Stay tuned, everyone, for the final chapter of our economic journey. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been through a lot, haven't we? Supply and demand, global trade, those geopolitical wild cards. But I'm ready to bring it all home now. How do we actually use all this knowledge, to make better decisions in this crazy economic world?
Well, that's the big question, right? It's one thing to understand the theory. It's another to actually apply it to our lives, our investments.
Exactly. So let's talk strategy. What are some practical things that our listeners can take away from all this? Things they can actually use, whether they're, at the grocery store or managing their retirement savings.
One of the biggest takeaways, I think, is that economics is all about choices. Making choices when resources are scarce. We've got limited time, limited money, limited energy, and we have to figure out how to use those resources to get the most out of them.
So it's about recognizing those trade-offs.
Right.
And making smart choices.
Right. And that applies to everything, from our personal budgets to government policies. When you decide to buy that new phone, you're also deciding not to spend that money on something else. A vacation, paying off debt, investing.
It's that opportunity cost thing again.
Exactly. And being aware of those opportunity costs, that can help us make better decisions. Now, when it comes to investing, one of the key lessons is diversification.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Spread your investments across different asset classes, stocks, bonds, real estate. That way, if one area takes a hit, your whole portfolio doesn't go down with it.
Makes sense. So spread the risk.
Another important thing for investors to remember is the business cycle. Remember those peaks and troughs we talked about?
Oh, yeah, the economic roller coaster?
Well, if you understand where we are in the cycle, you can adjust your strategy. So during a boom, you might be more willing to take some risks. But when things are slowing down, you might want to be a bit more conservative.
So align your investments with what's happening in the broader economy.
Exactly. And remember, we talked about inflation and how it affects investments. If inflation's high, you want to make sure your investments are earning enough to stay ahead of those rising prices. Otherwise, your money's losing value.
Yeah, you got to keep an eye on those economic indicators.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And lastly, I think it's so important for investors to stay informed about what's happening in the world. Those geopolitical risks we talked about. What happens in one country can affect markets all over the globe.
It's like we're all connected now. So paying attention to those global events, that's part of being a smart investor.
It is. And remember, investing, it's not just about numbers. It's also about psychology, understanding human behavior. Sometimes markets get caught up in these irrational swings.
Right. So you got to blend that economic knowledge with an understanding of, how people act, which isn't always rational.
Exactly. And maybe the most important takeaway is that learning never stops. The economy is always changing, so you got to stay curious, keep learning new things, and don't be afraid to question your assumptions.
I love that. It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about having that growth mindset, right? Always learning, always adapting.
Well said. I think we've really covered a lot in this deep dive. We've explored some pretty complex stuff, but hopefully you've come away with some tools, some insights that you can actually use.
It's been a great journey. And a huge thanks to all our listeners for coming along with us on this economic adventure. We hope you've learned something new and that you feel more confident navigating this complex world.
And remember, economics is everywhere. It's in the choices we make every day, the policies our governments create, the forces that connect us all globally. So stay curious, keep learning, and never stop asking those important questions.
That's the spirit of the deep dive. Until next time.